It started on an ordinary day in a quiet neighborhood, but what happened next would leave everyone talking. A young black boy, no older than 8, approached a police officer with it started on an ordinary day in a quiet neighborhood, but what happened next would leave everyone talking. A young black boy, no older than 8, approached a police officer with. The officer decided to ask more questions, hoping to piece together what was really happening. "Do you live close by?" he asked gently. The boy nodded but didn't offer much else. The officer could sense his unease, like he was afraid to say too much. Was there someone he was scared of? A situation he couldn't explain? Looking around, the officer noticed a small apartment complex nearby, its paint peeling and windows cracked. Maybe the boy lived there, but if so, why wasn't anyone looking out for him? The idea of a child wandering the streets alone, hungry, gnawed at the officer. He decided to take a chance. "Can you show me where you live?" he asked. The boy hesitated, his eyes wide with uncertainty. As they started walking, the officer couldn't shake the feeling that something much bigger was at play, something that wouldn't be easy to uncover. As the officer and the boy approached the apartment complex, the air felt heavier, like something unseen lingered just out of sight. The boy slowed his steps, glancing nervously at the windows. "It's up there," he said softly, pointing to a door on the second floor. The officer noticed the dim lighting in the hallways and the silence that seemed unnatural, as if no one wanted to be seen or heard. When they reached the door, the boy hesitated, his small hand hovering over the handle. "Are you sure it's safe to go in?" the officer asked, his voice steady but concerned. The boy didn't answer, but the look in his eyes said enough. Suddenly, the door creaked open slightly, and a shadow moved inside. The officer's instincts kicked in, his hand instinctively resting near his radio. He didn't know what or who was waiting on the other side. The door opened wider, revealing a man standing in the dimly lit room. His face was lined with worry, but there was something else in his expression, anxiety mixed with frustration. The boy froze, gripping the officer's hand tightly. "What's going on here?" the officer asked, his voice firm but calm. The man sighed deeply, glancing at the boy before speaking. "He shouldn't have gone outside," the man muttered, avoiding eye contact. "I told him to stay put." The officer noticed how the man's hands fidgeted, as if hiding something. "He came to me because he was hungry," the officer said. "Is there a reason he's not being fed?" The man hesitated, the tension in the room thickening. "It's not what you think," he said finally. "We've been struggling, but there's more to this than you know." Before the officer could respond, a loud crash echoed from another room. Both the boy and the man looked toward the sound, their faces pale with fear. Something wasn't right, and the officer knew he had to act quickly. The officer moved cautiously, his hand hovering near his radio. "Stay here," he said to the boy, and stepped into the dimly lit hallway toward the source of the crash. The man hesitated, but eventually followed. As they approached a closed door, the officer could hear muffled voices, sharp and hurried. Pushing the door open, he found a woman inside, frantically gathering clothes and belongings into a bag. Her face was streaked with tears. She looked up, startled. "I didn't mean for it to get this bad," she said, her voice trembling. "We're being evicted. There's no food left, and I didn't know what else to do." The man stood silently, his shoulders slumping under the weight of her words. The officer glanced back at the boy, who'd peeped around the corner, his wide eyes filled with fear. "You should have asked for help," the officer said, his tone softening. As the family's struggle unfolded, the officer realized the situation wasn't just about hunger. It was about survival. He made a call, arranging for temporary assistance, and promised to connect them with resources. Just as he was leaving, the boy tugged on his sleeve and whispered, "Thank you." But as the officer walked back to his car, he couldn't shake one thought. How many other doors hid stories just like this one? As the officer drove away, he couldn't help but glance back at the apartment. The boy stood by the window, waving faintly, a small glimmer of hope in his eyes. The officer knew this was just one family's story, but it struck a deep chord. Later that night, he reflected on what had unfolded. It wasn't just about offering food or shelter. It was about seeing people, truly seeing them, in their most vulnerable moments. The boy's simple plea for help had uncovered a story of struggle, love, and resilience. The officer filed a report and followed up with local organizations to ensure the family got the support they needed. He couldn't solve every problem, but he'd done what he could. Driving into the quiet night, he reminded himself of a powerful truth. Sometimes, even the smallest act of kindness can change everything. The boy's clothes were worn, and his small hands clutched his stomach as if trying to quiet the hunger he couldn't ignore. The officer knelt down, meeting his gaze, and asked softly, "Where are your parents?" The boy hesitated, his eyes darting to the ground. "They're not home," he mumbled, his voice cracking. Something about the way he spoke, the mixture of fear and desperation, sent a chill through the officer. It was clear this wasn't just about missing a meal. The officer glanced around, noticing how quiet the street was, as if the neighborhood itself held secrets. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this boy's story, something hidden behind his timid words. People passing by barely noticed, but the boy's vulnerability stayed with the officer. He decided he couldn't walk away. But what could he do? What was really going on?